Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, Secretary Johnson. I guess
fast entry and exit.
they whisk you off the stage.
Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile to take a moment here in Washington and around the world to just say when things go well. The Secretary of Homeland Security, we have just gone through, knock on wood, the Pope's incredibly successful visit in terms of security. 170 heads of state, the President of the United States, the Vice President. I just came back from New York. There was gridlock. We couldn't get around, but security worked. So the President did a shout out to Homeland Security.
Well, first of all, thank you for that, Andrea. I also want to thank you for doing this on a busy news day, I know.
Oh, Russian planes bombing civilian targets in Syria. Emails about to be released.
Andrea Mitchell is the hardest working journalist in this town, and in my judgment represents the best in national political journalism.
Well,
so let's give her a hand.
But the men and women of the Secret Service and all of the other security law enforcement officials
yes.
are the real heroes.
We had the confluence of two national special security events, not just one. And NSSE is the General Assembly or a National Political Convention. We had two. We had the General Assembly, which was larger than usual this year, 170 world leaders, plus the Pope. The 170 included, as you know, the President of China and lots of other very, very important top visible world leaders. This has been planned for months. Joe Clancy, the director of the Secret Service, visited the Vatican. I visited the Vatican. We visited Philadelphia. We visited New York countless times. We know every detail in Washington. The Secret Service is responsible for the security of all these people, primarily, which involves planning the traffic patterns, the arrival times, dealing with their own security details and the relationship between ours and theirs, dealing with our own president, our own vice president, who was in New York yesterday, and dealing with the Pope, who very much wanted to be with the people, who wanted to be able to kiss the babies. And this happened all at the same time. It was Secret Service, Homeland Security investigations of my department lent a couple of hundred, if not several thousand people, as well as the Coast Guard doing maritime security, TSA, the magnetometers. We screened several 100,000 people in the city of Philadelphia alone for the public events there. And it was, so far as I could see, flawless in its execution. It was successful and it was a safe event for the protectees as well as the American public. And the Pope and the other world leaders, in my judgment, got to see the best of our country and our democracy.
Were there any moments with the Pope where you got nervous because he wanted to be out and among the crowds?
Well, the crowds were along the parade routes were screened. They had to go through magnetometers, but it was an enormous screening effort to screen several 100,000 people in Philadelphia alone, and it was flawlessly executed. I was told that this Pope does not like to be late for anything, and he was not. He stayed on time. He kept us on time, and it was a remarkable effort. My department, more than any other in the U.S. government, I think, was committed to this enormous undertaking, along with, obviously, the Philadelphia Police, the Washington Metro Police, the NYPD, and the other federal agencies. But we committed a tremendous amount to this, and I will breathe easy, finally, in about 2 days, when I think critical mass is over. But
now,
it is a good piece of good news. You're absolutely right.
Now, as the President was meeting with Vladimir Putin, a bipartisan Homeland Security task force of 6 months investigation reported that we are basically failing at stopping recruits going to ISIS, that the numbers have doubled in the past year. We now have twice as many jihadis joining up in Syria. They come from 100 countries. There are 5,000 Westerners with valid Western passports, including 250 Americans estimated, and a good number who have come back into the United States. How do we get control of this?
Well, I've reviewed that report, and I give Chairman McCall and Congressman Thompson and that committee a lot of credit for undertaking that report. I agree in large part with what it says, and it also recommends a number of things that we're already doing. You're right, the numbers of foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria is large. The estimates are around 25,000. We estimate that approximately 250 have left this country or attempted to leave to go to Iraq and Syria. And there are some, not very large numbers, but there are some who have come back who we are tracking very carefully. But there is definitely an unknown factor, broken travel, hidden travel. But we have systems in place to track those individuals, and that is something that this committee recommends and that we are making pretty aggressive steps to do, to learn how to track people who engage in broken travel. Involves working with foreign governments, like the government of Turkey, for example, on what they see, more and more information sharing. This is something we talked about yesterday at the UN, and it's something that I'll be talking about with some of our European partners in December. In August of this year, I directed certain security enhancements to our visa waiver program. There are 38 countries for which we do not require a visa to come here. And so I directed that we have certain requirements with respect to those countries that are sending people here in terms of a requirement, for example, that they use the Interpol database if they want to be in our visa waiver program, that there be greater use of federal air marshals on their flights, that they themselves use advanced passenger information, passenger name recognition information like we do in this country to track people as they travel. And there are a number of things that we are doing, but this is a very serious phenomenon that lends strength to ISIL in that part of the world.
So ISIL is winning.
I wouldn't say that. They have enormous strength on the ground, without a doubt. Through our military campaign, we have taken out a number of leaders. And from my perspective, here in the Homeland, what I see is the global terrorist threat to our country has evolved away from, but in addition to, the terrorist-directed attacks that are exported into this country, like 9/11, for example, to terrorist-inspired attacks through social media. The so-called lone wolf could be inspired by something he sees here in this country, which requires an all-of-government approach, including, things in this country like countering violent extremism at home.
The same task force is reporting that more jihadis are going there than we are taking out with our airstrikes.
There is very definitely a serious issue with people going into Iraq and Syria that we need to control. And so that involves working with border countries like Turkey about, helping them to secure their own border and a greater partnership in terms of information sharing about who's coming and going. But it also involves efforts right here in our own communities, discouraging people from falling prey to groups like ISIL, picking up and wanting to leave this country and go there.
You gave a speech recently about public discourse, and this plays into it. The social media, the online communication. What is the impact in Muslim communities here in the United States and elsewhere in the West when they see candidates saying that a Muslim should not be able to be president of the United States, when they see a candidate for the presidency not pushing back when there is offensive language about Muslims and offensive language about the President of the United States?
Well, they're offended and they have the right to be. And I spend a lot of time in Muslim communities myself in this job. They recoil whenever there's a terrorist attack. The groups I meet with hate ISIL, In their view, ISIL has hijacked their religion. It occupies no part of the Islamic faith, and they do suffer discrimination. So when I meet with Muslim communities about helping us in our homeland security efforts, I'm also very much in listening mode when it comes to their issues with profiling at airports, our immigration laws. We're building bridges. I think we need to go to the next level in helping them develop the counter message to ISIL. But
what are they telling you when you listen?
What they tell me is that our government should not be at war with Islam, and that ISIL, that the Islamic State is not Islam and it's not a state. It's a terrorist organization that is claiming the banner of a religion that occupies something like 1/4 of the world's population, and that it is a religion of peace and brotherhood, and they want people to understand that. I've gone to meetings of Muslim community leaders, for example, in Northern Virginia, where you meet some real patriots. They have their Boy Scouts there. They say the Pledge of Allegiance. And they want to help us in our efforts. And we need to build these bridges. We need to not alienate this community. We need to build these bridges. Given how the Homeland Security threat is evolving, we need to work with these communities who are in a position to know and hopefully interdict somebody who may be turning toward violence.
Secretary Kerry has now suggested that we could take in as many as 100,000 of these migrants from this civil war. Yet the refugees I speak to, some of whom are already here, say they are in no person's land because they are caught without status. They're waiting for applications to be approved. There is such a backlog even of the hundreds that we are now permitting in from Syria, and we don't have enough translators, Arabic speakers, we don't have enough vetters. How are we going to ramp up to accept 100,000 people in the next year or so?
Well, good question. 100,000 is the overall refugee number from around the world that we want to go to in FY17. This year, the goal is 70,000. Next year, it'll be a little higher, but within next year's group will be 10,000 Syrians. You are correct that it is a time-consuming process to conduct the security review for each refugee, and we have finite resources to do it, which requires people from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to conduct the interviews, people from the State Department. At the same time, CIS is doing screening for refugees. We've got a workforce committed to doing the asylum screening on the southwest border. So all of that points out that this is a careful process with finite resources, but we are committed to doing it. And it's also why I need a budget in about 10 hours. So I can't print money, and none of this is free.
Well, I think you're going to get a continuing resolution. At least the Senate has acted. I don't know about the House in the last hour or so, but I think you'd be okay till December. But after that, the process is clearly broken. How do you deal with ramping up for a presidential campaign? How many of these candidates are you going to have to cover?
Well, that's a good question.
Do you have requests from any of them yet?
That's a good question. And you obviously know the process. It is the Secretary of Homeland Security who makes the decision on recommendations from the congressional leadership about whether or not somebody gets Secret Service protection. As you know, at the moment, no candidate except Secretary Clinton has that. And I'm sure there will come a point when there is a recommendation brought to me, and I will have to make that decision. But the point is that if we don't repeal sequestration, it becomes awfully hard to fund the Secret Service in an election year. And then at the end of this year, we're going to have another former president to protect. And so, again, none of this is free, and I can't print money. So, this is yet one of many reasons why we need to repeal sequestration.
Now, you, as far as I know, because you were first at the Pentagon, you are one of the millions of people who have been vetted for government service within the last decade, presumably?
Several times, yes.
So China has everything about you. They know everything about you, correct?
I would not assume that.
Let's talk about the hacking. 22 million people, and now we know 5 million of them, their fingerprints were taken. There are reports that the CIA has had to withdraw several people from Embassy Beijing. We have covert operatives who presumably have lost their value as service. That's what they've been trained for, because now they've been exposed. How do we deal with the vulnerability of our government computers?
Well, in July, I gave a speech with a comprehensive plan for what we need to do for federalcivilian.gov cybersecurity. One very basic thing we need to do is enhance our capability across all federal agencies, which is what we're doing, to monitor, identify, and block intrusions from bad actors. And we have a system now that is in place for about half of the federal civilian workforce, and I've directed my people that we have to have this in place by the end of this year, or at least aspects of it, so that the entire federal government is covered. But one very basic thing that we're educating the workforce on is spear phishing. The most sophisticated and devastating attacks I have seen on a system occur because somebody opened an email that they shouldn't have. You can spend billions of dollars on security for the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, or NBC, but if one of your coworkers opens up an email and an attachment that they shouldn't have, then the bad actor is in the gate. And very often that is how a very sophisticated attack from a very sophisticated actor starts. So a lot of it is just basic education.
Well, the president and the Chinese president agreed on protocols going forward to prevent cyber warfare against corporate America or corporate China.
Yes.
But what about the evidence, hard evidence? The Wall Street Journal had a full report just this week on one hacker who was identified going all the way back to a Chinese military institution. So what about the evidence of what China is doing officially to hack into our government service?
We had some very, before the president's visit, I and others had some very frank discussions with very senior members of the Chinese delegation sent here by President Xi about cyber intrusions, cyber crime in general, much of which you've seen reflected in the statements that were issued when the presidents met. Time will tell whether or not the Chinese live up to
but
what
we don't seem to be willing to
on
retaliate because we can't risk an all-out war with China, a cyber war with China.
Well, I would say that everything is still on the table, and we reserve the right to and will consider appropriate actions in response to what we believe are attacks from any state actor or any bad actor. But we did agree to a lot on paper, including a ministerial level discussion routine between me and the Attorney General on our side and Chinese officials on their side going forward, and time will tell whether or not they're going to comply with what they committed to do on paper.
If our government computer systems are so vulnerable, would we be better off having private servers in our basements?
I could make a really good joke here, but I'm not.
Oh, go for it.
No, that's okay. We actually do block in the federal government thousands and thousands of infiltrations. But we've got to cover even more of all the federal agencies. On a daily basis, we block unwanted actors and root them out. But we've got to cover the entire federal government, and we've got to go after the bad actors who we don't necessarily recognize in the first instance. We're improving our technology to be able to do that. And so we're getting there. It's a work in progress. It is not where we need to be now, but one of my personal agendas while I'm secretary is a very aggressive timetable for concrete improvements to our federal civilian.gov.
Well, Jay Johnson, Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. I know
Thank you,
something
Andrea.
about how hard these jobs are. We thank you very much.